In October 2018, I went for a conference. But prior to the conference, I had made a mental list of people that I wanted to speak to once the conference was over. One of the people on my mental list was Dr. Monica Thompson. And I had chosen to speak to her because I thought her choice of a subject was interesting and bold. Bold not because of the topic itself, but because of the environment in which she was presenting it. She spoke about psychosocial sexual issues, which is in itself an ordinary topic. But in the UAE, which is known as a conservative culture, it was, like I said, bold. It was a good decision for me to attend her talk because she delivered with such clarity, softness, and coherence that I left feeling nothing short of impressed. And guess what? She was kind and patient enough to speak to me after her session. In my interview with her, the first part, we talk about the different mental health problems that present among the UAE population, where sexual issues fall on that list, and how the culture impacts the prevalence and presentation, basically, of sexual problems among the population. She's such a spirited person. At some point, I felt like she was interviewing me because she was so engaged and she has a wealth of knowledge. Listening to this interview will be totally worth your while. And so, as usual, I hope you stay to the end. So, first off, Dr. Thompson, could you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for those very lovely comments. It was great to see you and so many people who were so enthusiastic at the conference. And one of the main reasons I teach at the conference is because I think it's really important to spread awareness, particularly around mental health issues, where there's a lot of stigma. Okay, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist.
Okay.
You might hear from my accent that I'm British.
Yes.
I'm Black British. I'm very proud of my heritage. My parents are Afro-Caribbean from Jamaica.
Okay.
But I was born and raised in the UK. Right. I did all my training, all my 3 psychology degrees in the UK. So I continue, I'm very blessed. I've been in Dubai now, this is my 7th year.
Wow.
And not many black psychologists in Dubai.
Of course, I can confirm that.
Yeah, but I'm pleased there are increasingly more of us. That's one of the things I did when I was in the UK. Okay. I set up a group and it was about increasing diversity in clinical psychology.
That's excellent.
And I've been so proud of that. Fantastic people come through, not to do with me, but all about their ability, but being able to be given the chance is really important. So, as I said, hence now I try and do promoting mental health as much as I can. And in here, in the Dubai, I work with every single mental health presentation, which makes it a lot more fun. Because the more senior experience you get, you just see all the difficult cases, complex cases, and supervise everybody. But in Dubai, it's lovely. I see anxiety, depression, such are the more treatable conditions and psychosexual problems, as well as some more complex problems.
Okay. So so that's first off, you just answered what my next question would have been, which is the most common problems that you see here in Dubai. Now, off the top of your head, what would you say are some of the causes of, or the most common causes of some of these problems? Okay. So you mentioned anxiety, for example.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because that is the number one problem in Dubai. It's not the only problem. We all see, I always say mental health doesn't discriminate. Doesn't matter what country you live in, even if you don't term it a mental health problem, don't have a label for such kind of feelings.
It is what it is.
Exactly, it is what it is. And people always experience these kind of difficulties in response to a whole range of factors. And in Dubai, they have all the usual mental health difficulties, but anxiety is one of the most common problems that people present with to their GPs and definitely to clinical psychologists such as myself.
Of course.
And 1 in 4 people just around the world will develop a mental health problem in their lifetime. And that gets talked about more or less depending on where you live.
Right.
And I think we're all still trying to understand why there's such a high prevalence of anxiety in Dubai. And one of the things I know about the UAE as a whole, in particular Dubai, is less than 20% of the people who live here are locals or indigenous population. So the vast majority of us are what we call expats.
Yes.
And with expats, most people come here for work, it's tax-free, and people think it's a fantastic life in the sun, but actually people work really, really hard.
They do.
And there are lots and lots of, for example, labourers who people might hear about who get very poorly paid and work in excruciatingly hot conditions. I never understood the concept of a country being too hot because I come from a cold country like England, so I love the idea of coming to the heat.
Yes.
And now I tell my friends, don't come over summer, it's unbearable.
I can't deal with it.
Exactly, and it's humid. So if you can
Especially in
imagine-
August.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine the labourers who are working all hours, I mean, thank goodness the labour laws have changed quite a lot, and Dubai's done a lot to improve that.
Yes.
And they're mostly working at night now, although they can't do a lot of noise at night. But, you know, it's still extremely hot. So
Yes.
basically, that's an example of a lot of conditions that people work really hard in here. Doesn't matter what job you have. But also, one of the biggest factors, I think, is that expats often don't have their family around them, don't have all the support. It's hard enough for us to cope with problems, but not having your family and support can make
Makes
it
it
even
so
more
much harder.
difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And often, the rules here are quite different, but often it might mean that if you're having a hard time at work, it's much more difficult for you to protest because you're under your work visa. It's not so easy to just leave and get another job. If you leave your job, you're supposed to leave the country. And a lot of people are under pressure to be able to provide for their relatives back home.
Absolutely.
So even people, taxi drivers, you know, they work 12 hours a day, which I think is incredible. And but a lot of them tell me, a lot of them are from, you know, countries close by like India and Pakistan, and they say, even though it's hard work and I hate working this hard, it means I'm able to develop a school
Yes,
in my village
yes.
or pay for my children's education.
I can provide for my family
Exactly.
somehow. Yes.
So can you imagine, you're going to put up with all kinds of pressures
Right. Right.
to just for those basic means really, and not be able to stand up for yourself. So it's understandable things like anxiety can creep in.
Of course. So we wouldn't necessarily say that the problems here, or let's say anxiety as we're talking
Yeah.
about, we wouldn't necessarily say that it's culture dependent.
Yes.
It's just the environment that
Yes.
you sort of find yourself
Yeah,
in. Okay.
absolutely. I mean, with anxiety, like with all mental health problems, there are a whole range of causative factors. We used to talk before a lot about nature or nurture. We tend not to talk about that so much because what we know is somebody might have a biological predisposition. So genetically, I mean, it's very rare for me to meet somebody, and a grown adult with anxiety, who hasn't had a parent of some sort with anxiety. So some might say that's modelling. They've learnt this through the parent, how the parent behaves. The parent might teach them to be really overcautious as a child and not take risks or see the world as a dangerous place.
Yes, yeah.
But equally, it might be that it's a more genetic component. Yeah. But we kind of tend to think about probably both, you know, interplay with each other. And the most important thing, I think, is it's quite difficult to find causative factors, but it's more important about looking at, well, what do we need to do to help you with this now?
Absolutely. Okay. Oh, that's very insightful. So I'm going to take us back to one of the main things that I wanted us to talk today, which is, you know, treating people who have sexual problems and talking about it in a cultural context, because we know that it's a relatively conservative culture that we live in Dubai.
Right.
So first of all, ask, in your opinion or in your experience, how does culture usually impact the expression of sexuality among the people that you see?
Okay. Well, firstly, I will say that one of the things I was most pleased about with my conference was that it was mostly qualified psychologists, and quite a number of them were Muslims, some of them veiled, covered.
Absolutely.
And students there as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, and I just talked my usual language, and a lot of people came up to me afterwards and said, I'm so relieved, because I was a bit worried about how you would talk about this difficult subject, but actually it was so sensitive and da-da-da-da-da. And I was relieved because I was talking about it in the way that I would talk about it with anybody, in any culture, in the way I would talk about it in the UK. And you may recall we had some discussions when people were talking about what language do we use and how do I talk about my children with these kind of sexual areas.
Yes.
And we made jokes about in every single culture, there are terms that we use for children, where we call our private parts, but when we go to the doctor, we can't say my new or my this or my that. And actually being factual and using real biological terms is really, really important, because then there's a discourse for everybody to understand what you mean by that. And you can look up vagina, you can look up penis, you can look up orgasm. These are technical terms that shouldn't bring embarrassment and shame. They're biological terms. So I find talking in biological basic language, really, not trying to confuse people. One of the things I often say with my clients is I try and get them to clarify what they think I mean by it, and I clarify what they mean by I'm having problems down there. What does down there mean? Now, I might have forgotten your question. So you're talking about how to speak to people?
The main thing was asking how culture impacts the expression of sexuality.
Okay.
So yes, language comes in there because it appears some cultures might be more open or might be more prone to calling things as they are, as opposed to other cultures. And it ties in with another question that I was going to ask about secrecy and confidentiality.
Okay.
Is there a difference? Do you draw a line between these two things? And again...
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, very good question. I'll come back to secrecy and confidentiality. Language is really important in terms of culture.
Of course.
But one of the other things is where I think culture plays a big role. I'm a woman, and I'm a very proud feminist. That doesn't mean I'm anti-men at all, but I believe in equality. Men and women should be exactly equal. That's what feminism means. And so I also come from the West. I come from the UK, where, just like the US, there's a lot written about women, there's a lot of expression that we should be enjoying sex, and sex should be pleasurable. We're not just having sex to procreate. And lots of women nowadays choose not to have children if that's what they want, but they should be able to be enjoying sex. And I know there are a number of cultures where sex isn't deemed in that way, and so it's thought to be a shameful act unless it's just for procreation. And there are a number of cultures, not just in the African continent, but in other places as well, where it breaks my heart to know girls are, invaded in their bodies in a way, so sex is never going to be enjoyable for them.
Of course.
And
not to cut you off, but just to bring an example to this, I will mention the female genital mutilation.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking
which
about.
happens in parts of the country where I'm from, which is Ghana. So I know about this.
There you go.
Exactly.
And I've actually, I used to work with some women who had these difficulties in the UK.
Right.
But I've also seen a few women here who are Muslim women, actually, where it's been done. So it even happens here, but it's not spoken about a lot in secrecy.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking to know that this is done, and the women can grow up with no choice to ever experience the sexual pleasure. There's a reason, if you think from a biological basis, there's a reason why we have exactly certain parts of our body and our vagina that are going to become aroused and excited, and that's the natural biological order of things. So I guess that's the powerful role that culture can play. And I say culture because it gets repeated even by women who will take their children to do this because it was done to them. And so this is how they understand. And that's culture. That's not about, religion or rule or anything else. That's about a culture, isn't it?
Passed down from one generation to
what
the next.
becomes the norm.
Indeed.
So that's a very powerful way in which how cultural factors can really interfere. So I'm very lucky that I came from a culture where that just is not seen as the norm. And I know that there's some fantastic women, Desert Flower, that film and book, for example, who in some of these countries, like the African continent, are standing up and speaking against it to try and change the culture. And in terms of secrecy and confidentiality, gosh, that's a good question.
So, but just before we go to that, do you when people feel restricted? When their culture restricts them with regards to expressing their sexuality, do you think that it impacts their overall well-being in any way?
Oh, without question. Having a psychosexual problem, psychosexual really means you're having a problem with a sexual problem, as in physically something problem having sex, some sort of aspect of sex, and there's affecting you psychologically. So having a sexual problem per se is going to affect you. And one of the things I talked about at my conference is the shame. People think this is not normal. I see men, they have problems that we call erectile dysfunction. They might have premature ejaculation, problems getting erections or problems maintaining erections, all of these things. And they feel emasculated. I'm not manly enough. Because there's always a myth, all these stud men and keep your erection for hours and all this stuff. There are also cultural myths about black and white men and sex and sexual prowess.
Indeed.
And, the same thing for women. And particularly, for example, even in countries where you're not meant to enjoy sex, thought to at least, if you're having problems having sex, then that might mean you're not able to have sex, you're not able to procreate, and then you're deemed as less than somebody else, you feel inferior, shame. So all mental health problems sadly carry a stigma, but it's even more loaded because most people find it very difficult to talk openly about having sexual problems.
Absolutely.
So that impacts on somebody's psychological well-being and their mental
generally.
health even more. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay.
And that can lead to depression, all kinds of things.
And even anxiety.
Oh yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, back to our question about confidentiality and secrecy. I think that with certain cultures, and this is my thinking, so I'm happy to discuss it with you. Are we able to differentiate the two?
I think it's a really interesting question because I haven't thought about it so much in a cultural context, but now you've made me think about it as such.
Let me ask you this. Can you think of an equivalent word in your mother tongue or your first language for confidentiality? No? How about secrecy? So these two words are so important, not just for the work of psychologists, but to us as individuals, because they impact, our perception of what is worth sharing and what we absolutely shouldn't share but keep to our chest. And this borders a little bit on shame. And I ask about this because there's a lot of secrecy that surrounds sexual issues, especially in different cultural contexts. So that's a subject that Dr. Monica Thompson and I just raised. We cover it extensively in the second part of this interview, and I'll encourage that you join us. While you join us, leave your comments and leave your questions and contribute any way that you can to this conversation. My name is Baba Dadzi, and you've been listening to Hearts and Minds Aloud. If you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and like this podcast. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Hearts and Minds Aloud. Thank you for listening. The conversation is getting bigger, so be here next week.